On the 13th of June, 1943, the first trains carrying captured soldiers of the Afrika Korps crossed the humid lowlands of Virginia. Through the open windows, they saw a world that should not have existed in wartime. Electric lights burned along every road, filling the night with a steady amber glow. Gasoline pumps gleamed at crossroads. Factories shone like constellations, their smokestacks crowned with flame. For men who had lived under blackouts since 1940, the sight felt unreal, an empire of light that never slept. They were traveling in passenger coaches, not freight wagons. Cushioned seats, fans humming above, cool air drifting from vents that some guards called air conditioning. It was a phrase most of them had never heard. The train's motion was smooth, electric, confident. Outside, the landscape rolled past in abundance. Fields heavy with corn, silos painted white, barns roofed with silver tin. No bomb scars, no rubble, no war, just a vast functioning country. The omniscient eye of history sees their thoughts converging in silence. They tried to convince themselves it was illusion, that America displayed its riches only along the rails. Yet mile after mile, the pattern never broke. Filling stations every few minutes, warehouses stacked with grain, rivers of trucks along paved highways. Each scene dismantled another fragment of the mythology they had carried from Europe, that the United States was soft, chaotic, decadent. At midnight, the train passed through Roanoke. From above, the city looked like a furnace, rail yards blazing with sodium light, freight cranes moving with mechanical rhythm. Even the darkness glowed. One prisoner counted the locomotives idling on sidings, 11 in a single station, each larger than anything he had seen in Germany. Later historians would call this moment the beginning of ideological collapse, when disbelief yielded to comprehension. In the following hours, they crossed state lines unseen in the dark, the rails stretching westward toward Tennessee. The car smelled of oil, coffee, and new cloth. Some tried to sleep, most could not. The mind of the soldier trained for scarcity could not reconcile itself with this effortless plenty. They had been told America's industry was fragile, dependent on outsiders, limited by greed. But through the glass, they watched a machine nation running on light. By dawn, the horizon turned gold over endless farmland. Silos stood like artillery, each filled with enough grain to feed a regiment for months. Convoys of trucks moved along parallel roads carrying milk, meat, vegetables, supplies in motion, precise as clockwork. The omniscient voice of memory records what none of them yet understood, that this rolling ocean of food and fuel was not the surface of American power, but its foundation. Hours later, as the train slowed near the temporary camp at Mexia, Texas, the men saw new lines of freight cars stretching to the horizon. Each bore the stenciled markings of the Quartermaster Corps. Inside were sacks of flour, sugar, and coffee, destined for armies thousands of miles away. To the prisoners, it looked infinite. The nation that could feed itself so richly was also feeding the world while fighting two wars. The engines hissed, brakes clamped, steel sang. The prisoners stepped onto the platform and felt the heat of the Texas sun. Above them, power lines buzzed, carrying current to factories they would never see. That sound, the hum of energy flowing without interruption, was the true anthem of America in 1943. Later, long after the war, they would describe that first night as the moment when the darkness of Europe ended. It was not defeat that humbled them, but light, endless, industrial, merciless in its brilliance. In the silence between the rails and the sky, they realized that the war they had fought was already lost to electricity, to production, and to the simple fact that America could feed the world and still go on fighting. By late June of 1943, the heat settled heavy over central Texas. Inside Camp Mexia, rows of wooden barracks baked beneath the sun. For the captured men of the Afrika Korps, the air smelled not of dust or diesel, but of something they had almost forgotten: food. Every morning at 7, the mess hall bell rang, and the line of uniforms wound past a counter stacked with white bread, butter, eggs, and metal pitchers of cold milk beaded with condensation. To men who had survived on ersatz coffee and black bread measured in ounces, it felt like a hallucination. The omniscient chronicler sees them hesitate, afraid to believe this abundance was real. They expected propaganda, a stage built to deceive them. But the routine never changed. 3 meals a day, precise, unhurried. Mondays brought oatmeal with sugar. Wednesdays, meat stew, thick with vegetables. On Sundays, something beyond comprehension. Ice cream, smooth, cold, absurdly sweet. Each spoonful was a revelation. It melted on the tongue like proof that everything they had been told about America was wrong. The kitchen logs still survive. Quartermaster records show that Camp Mexia received weekly deliveries of 200 gallons of milk, 100 loaves of bread daily, and fresh fruit trucked from California. The rations equaled or exceeded those issued to American soldiers. It was not charity. It was system. A logistical machine built to nourish millions across oceans. In that fact lay the quiet power of the United States, an industrial confidence expressed through food. The prisoners began to study their captors' routine. They watched trucks arrive at dawn, unloading sacks of flour stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. They noted that nothing ever ran out. Even waste was plentiful. Bread crusts discarded, milk left half-finished, pies cooling untouched. In the German imagination, war meant scarcity, the noble endurance of hunger. Here, abundance was discipline. Supply was strategy. Historians tracing these accounts describe a slow psychological inversion. What began as disbelief became envy, then respect, and finally resignation. The men who once believed in the efficiency of the Reich realized that true efficiency meant comfort, not sacrifice. A soldier who ate well could fight longer, think clearer, march farther. Food itself was a weapon, forged in factories, shipped by rail, refrigerated by electricity. One entry from a guard's report captures the quiet revolution. The Germans no longer barter or hide bread. They eat until full and leave what's left. Hunger, that constant companion of Europe, had no place here. In its absence grew something more dangerous to ideology: understanding. The omniscient voice reminds us that at that moment, in fields 1,000 miles away, American farmers harvested wheat by the million bushels, while factories in Chicago produced canned meat faster than the Wehrmacht could consume its rations. Behind every plate served in Camp Mexia stood an empire of production, railways, refrigeration, and the mathematics of plenty. When night came, the prisoners lay on cots listening to the hum of distant machinery. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, engines churned, bottling milk, freezing ice cream, baking tomorrow's bread. The sound was steady, relentless, merciful. They did not yet know that this rhythm, the industrial heartbeat of nourishment, would echo through every corner of the war. Later, long after repatriation, some would speak of the first taste of ice cream as the moment they understood defeat. It was not humiliation, but revelation, a spoonful of cold sweetness proving that a nation at war could still afford generosity. The war of guns was ending. The war of production had already been won. By the first week of July 1943, the prisoners had begun to understand that the camp's silence was deceptive. Beyond the barbed wire, America moved in rhythms measured by steel and steam. At night they heard it, the deep rolling thunder of freight cars grinding east and west, a metallic heartbeat pulsing through the plains. It never ceased. Not for storms, not for Sundays, not for war. From the watchtowers, guards could see the double lines of the Southern Pacific Railroad glowing faintly in the moonlight. Every few minutes, a headlamp appeared, a blazing white eye, followed by a procession of boxcars stretching half a mile, loaded with grain, beef, gasoline, and munitions. Each train carried the same white stencil, U.S. Army Transportation Corps. Each represented a mathematics of movement that Germany, for all its precision, could not match. The omniscient narrator sees the prisoners counting silently, 1, 2, 10, 20, until the clatter blurred into a single unbroken sound. In Europe, a supply train was a miracle, guarded, camouflaged, precious. Here it was routine. Locomotives burned oil without hesitation, water towers overflowed, sparks flew against an indifferent sky. Nothing in this system acknowledged scarcity. Historical records show that by midsummer 1943, American railroads moved 1.5 billion tons of freight annually, more than the combined output of all Axis lines. Between Chicago and the Gulf Coast, an average of one train left every 5 minutes, each synchronized to arrive within seconds of schedule. No nation in history had ever achieved such coordination. The war was being fought not only with bullets, but with timetables. In Camp Mexia, the men began to measure nights by trains instead of hours. They learned the distinct rhythms, the long hauls of grain from Kansas, the tank cars from Houston refineries, the reefers carrying meat packed in ice. When the wind shifted, they could smell the difference. Diesel, coal, raw wheat, iron. It became the scent of inevitability. The omniscient voice recalls that some prisoners started keeping notes, attempting to estimate the tonnage, the frequency, the direction. Within weeks, they abandoned the effort. The numbers dissolved into infinity. Every conclusion led to the same realization. The United States was not improvising war. It was manufacturing continuity. Historians later describe this as the logistical revelation. Men trained to worship the German ideal of order discovered an order far larger, impersonal, and absolute. The trains symbolized a civilization that had fused its geography into one machine. While Europe starved, this machine delivered breakfast to soldiers on 2 oceans and still had surplus to waste. At dawn, when the last echoes faded into the horizon, the camp returned to stillness. But in that stillness, the men heard what would haunt them long after captivity. The knowledge that somewhere, even now, another train was beginning its journey, loaded with everything a modern war required. The sound of wheels on rails was the sound of defeat rendered in metal. Later generations would speak of it as the endless convoy, the proof that America's true weapon was motion itself. The trains never stopped because the nation behind them never paused, not to rebuild, not to rest, not even to doubt. Each mile of track was a declaration written in steel, that abundance, once set in motion, cannot be conquered. By mid-July of 1943, the work details began. Groups of prisoners were loaded into canvas-topped trucks and driven beyond the wire to the fields of central Texas. They expected primitive agriculture, horses, sweat, the slow rhythm of manual labor. Instead, they stepped into a mechanical landscape. Combines roared like tanks across oceans of wheat. Tractors the size of armored cars dragged plows through soil, black and endless. Each machine bore painted numbers, serial codes, factory markings. Farming here was not toil, it was production. The omniscient chronicler sees their astonishment as they watched one farmer manage what in Europe required an entire village. He drove from field to field with oil-stained hands and a radio mounted to the dashboard. He consulted weather forecasts transmitted by shortwave. He measured yields in bushels, not in hope. His barn housed gasoline engines, welders, spare parts. Every tool had a replacement. Nothing waited for repair. It was fixed before it failed. Quartermaster reports confirm that by 1943, the average American farm produced twice the output of its German equivalent with 1/3 the labor. Electricity reached 90% of rural households. The Tennessee Valley Authority powered irrigation pumps, refrigeration units, and grain elevators operating day and night. The line between factory and farm had vanished. Production was continuous, mechanical, almost indifferent to weather. The prisoners worked under supervision, but with relative freedom. They loaded crates of melons, sacks of wheat, baskets of peaches bound for the canneries. The scale defied reason. Each truck carried more food than their hometowns had seen in a season. When one vehicle broke down, another arrived within minutes. Supply never paused. Abundance was self-replacing. The omniscient eye lingers on their thoughts, envy mixed with revelation. They had believed technology belonged to war, not to harvest. Here, machines served peace and profit with equal precision. The same industrial discipline that built bombers now produced bread. It was the fusion of agriculture and assembly line, the true secret weapon of democracy. At dusk, as they rode back to camp, the horizon glowed not from cities, but from processing plants working through the night. Conveyor belts carried grain into silos, refrigeration tanks hissed, motors droned. It was the sound of civilization feeding itself without interruption. No famine, no fear of winter, only momentum. Historians later traced these impressions through diaries smuggled home after the war. The entries share one refrain: they could feed the world if they wished. For soldiers raised in scarcity, that realization was spiritual defeat. The fields of Texas, more than any battlefield, revealed why Germany would lose. Not because of courage or strategy, but because it fought a nation that had turned food into industry. When the trucks reached the gate, the men looked back once more at the glowing silos, tall as cathedrals, and understood what they had witnessed. The miracle was not harvest, it was permanence. The farms of America were not fields. They were factories of survival, powered by faith in abundance, running forever forward like the trains that fed them. By the first days of August 1943, the work details shifted from fields to factories. Trucks carried the prisoners south toward the Gulf, where rows of low buildings shimmered under a white sun. From the distance they looked unremarkable, sheds of corrugated steel, but inside the air hummed with machinery. Conveyor belts rattled, steam valves hissed, metal lids clattered like distant gunfire. This was not an armory. It was a cannery. Here, the new American weapon was food preserved in tin. The omniscient chronicler watches them pause at the entrance, the smell of fruit and salt overpowering the odor of grease. Women in white caps worked the lines with the discipline of soldiers. Each motion was timed, identical, tireless. Peaches slid down polished chutes into brine, sealed, labeled, stacked in pyramids that reached the rafters. Every few minutes a forklift moved another mountain of cans toward refrigerated warehouses where the air bit like winter. Quartermaster archives confirm that by midsummer 1943, American canneries produced more than 4 billion units of food annually. Factories in Illinois, California, and Texas operated 3 shifts a day, feeding an army spread across 2 oceans. The prisoners saw only one fragment of the system, yet it was enough. The building consumed power as freely as breath, electric motors, fluorescent lights, refrigeration compressors rumbling beneath the floor. No blackout curtains, no fear of air raids, only production without interruption. Inside the cold storage rooms, the temperature hung just above freezing. Rows of meat, milk, butter, and vegetables filled endless aisles. Thermometers glowed behind glass, the red line steady. The Germans had never imagined such control of temperature, such mastery over decay. Food here obeyed industry, not nature. Time itself had been mechanized. The omniscient narrator senses their unspoken realization. This was the true front of the war. Every sealed can was a bullet against hunger, every refrigerator a fortress against chaos. While Europe rationed crumbs, America stockpiled permanence. The nation's victory would not only be fought but stored, cool, clean, organized, waiting. Historians later called this moment the refrigeration revelation. It marked the prisoners' final surrender to comprehension. They understood that even if the Allies stopped fighting, the machinery of supply would continue, unstoppable as the seasons it had conquered. Abundance had become infrastructure, preservation, ideology. When the shift ended, the men rode back through the evening heat. Behind them, the cannery lights burned on, indifferent to fatigue. Through the dust, they could still see the glint of countless cans stacked like ammunition, each holding a portion of America's endless harvest. In that reflection, they glimpsed the secret that no general could counter, a civilization that had learned how to bottle time, how to feed armies and nations alike, and how to make plenty eternal. By September of 1943, the prisoners had been scattered in labor detachments across the American heartland. Some worked in food plants, others on farms, a few near small towns where they could observe civilian life. What struck them most was not the factories, nor the machines, it was the children. Every afternoon, the school bell rang, and lines of students filed into cafeterias that smelled of bread and milk. To the German workers unloading produce nearby, the scene was incomprehensible. Wartime Europe's children queued for rations, America's queued for lunch. Trays clattered. Pitchers of cold milk passed hand to hand, slices of roast meat and apples set down by women in aprons. No slogans, no flags, no speeches, just order and plenty. The omniscient voice of history observes their disbelief. To them, this was the ultimate paradox. A nation fighting on 2 continents still fed its children as if peace had never ended. Official reports confirm that by late 1943, the U.S. Department of Agriculture supplied daily school meals to over 6 million students. Meat, vegetables, butter, fruit, all drawn from the same distribution system that sustained the army. Logistics did not distinguish between soldier and child. Both were components of the same equation of abundance. In the evenings, the prisoners returned to their barracks and compared what they had seen with what they remembered. In Germany, milk was a luxury measured by the spoonful. Here, it was poured into drains when unfinished. The moral weight of that waste pressed harder than any guard. It proved not arrogance, but confidence, proof that America possessed more than enough to lose. The omniscient narrator records how one prisoner, a former teacher from Hamburg, began keeping notes. He described the taste of the camp coffee, the smell of warm bread, and the sight of American children laughing with full mouths. "They are feeding the future," he wrote later, though he would never know that his words would survive. Historians would find his papers decades afterward, brittle but legible. Testimony to an empire of nourishment. Military supply records reveal the same pattern. Rations for the front mirrored those for schools, balanced calories, vitamins, fresh ingredients shipped in refrigerated cars. The same milk that filled classroom pitchers also reached mess tents in North Africa and Italy. It was the triumph of standardization, a child's lunch and a soldier's meal drawn from identical logistics. By autumn, the realization spread quietly through the camps. This was not coincidence. It was philosophy. A democracy fed everyone the same way. Its workers, its armies, its sons and daughters. Strength was measured not in conquest but in nutrition. The prisoners began to sense that they had underestimated a civilization whose greatest weapon was equality of appetite. At sunset, trains passed again, carrying flour east, beef west, milk north. The rhythm was endless, feeding soldiers and schoolchildren alike. Later generations would say this was the moment the prisoners understood that America's true victory was generational. It was winning tomorrow by feeding today. By October of 1943, the lesson had become undeniable. Food was not only sustenance, it was strategy. Across every camp and convoy, the Americans treated nourishment as an extension of command. A soldier's strength, a worker's rhythm, a nation's confidence, all measured in calories, logistics, and will. The omniscient voice recalls that this understanding dawned slowly among the prisoners. They began to see how every meal served within the fence reflected the larger machinery beyond it. The coffee that steamed in their tin cups had traveled 2,000 miles by ship, truck, and rail. The bread in their hands had been baked in automated lines that produced thousands of loaves per hour. It was all part of a single moral infrastructure, a promise that no one fighting for the United States would march hungry. In Germany, morale had been rationed like flour, issued sparingly, sweetened by slogans. Here it was baked into routine. Soldiers at the front, factory workers at midnight shifts, schoolchildren, and even prisoners shared the same rhythm of abundance. Hunger was the enemy, and America had defeated it before firing a shot. Quartermaster records from the period confirm that each American combatant received an average of 4,000 calories per day, including meat, fruit, and dessert. Supply officers spoke of energy per soldier as precisely as engineers spoke of horsepower. Field rations were tested, improved, and replaced within months, a constant evolution driven by morale rather than necessity. A satisfied soldier, they believed, fought longer, laughed louder, and thought clearer. The prisoners observed that the supply convoys never stopped. Trains unloaded fresh produce even as others departed full of canned goods. Warehouses pulsed with cold air, diesel fumes, and the scent of oranges. Every shipment carried the same message. Comfort was discipline, to be well-fed was to be organized, and organization was victory. Historians would later describe this policy as nutritional warfare. It waged battle not through deprivation, but through certainty. American propaganda rarely showed dead enemies. It showed breakfast being served. Photographs of soldiers smiling with coffee cups, sailors slicing pies, airmen chewing gum over Europe. Each image a signal to both friend and foe that morale was mass-produced, rationed as carefully as ammunition. Within the camps, the effect was profound. Former officers who had lectured about sacrifice now fell silent before the cafeteria tables. They realized that what they once called decadence was discipline perfected. The ability to feed millions without chaos demanded a precision no command could impose by fear alone. As autumn deepened, the nights grew cooler. From the guard towers, the prisoners watched the distant glow of towns, each one powered, stocked, and fed as if war were only a rumor. The omniscient narrator sees what they could not yet name: the moral inversion of total war. The Reich had turned hunger into loyalty. America turned nourishment into faith. Later, one historian would write that the Americans fought with kitchens as much as with rifles. Each oven, each mess hall, each milk truck was a front line in a quiet campaign for endurance. The outcome was already decided. The army that could serve hot coffee in a snowstorm had already conquered the cold. By November of 1943, the arithmetic of the war was beginning to speak louder than ideology. What the prisoners had felt in their stomachs was now confirmed by numbers too large to deny. America's abundance was no illusion. It was quantified, measured, and stamped on every crate and invoice that passed through the docks. The omniscient chronicler traces the records. In that year alone, the United States produced over 130 billion pounds of food. 40 billion pounds of meat, 7 billion bushels of grain, 5 billion gallons of milk. Every month, 20 million cans of vegetables left Midwestern factories. Every week, thousands of refrigerated rail cars carried butter and eggs across distances longer than Europe itself. It was industry expressed in calories. The prisoners heard fragments of this through guards, newspapers, rumor. At first they laughed. No nation could sustain such figures. But then the proof arrived daily on their plates. The white bread that never ran out, the sugar in their coffee, the meat stew thick enough to hide the spoon. Each meal was an equation solved. Every portion demonstrated that logistics, not heroism, defined the modern war. In their notebooks, some tried to calculate what it meant. One German engineer estimated that the United States could feed every citizen of occupied Europe and still supply its armies abroad. He was wrong. The numbers were even higher. Historians later confirmed that by late 1943, American agricultural exports alone exceeded the entire German harvest. The empire of scarcity had met a civilization that produced excess by design. The omniscient narrator reveals what the soldiers could not yet see. Behind each statistic stood a network, millions of workers, engines, and hands synchronized by the invisible logic of democracy. The myth of inefficiency, so carefully taught by propaganda, collapsed beneath the weight of tonnage and output. Quantity became philosophy, precision became faith. At Camp Mexia, shipments arrived faster than the kitchen could store them. New warehouses were built, then filled within weeks. There were so many cans, so much flour, that the cooks stacked sacks in the open air under tarps. No one guarded them. Theft was meaningless when everything was plentiful. That was perhaps the most demoralizing truth of all, that abundance itself was discipline, and waste, a privilege of victory. When winter came, the prisoners watched the trains continue through rain and frost, headlights cutting through the dark. The sound no longer shocked them. It was mathematics made audible, the rhythm of inevitability. Each passing car measured the distance between belief and understanding. They now knew the truth the Reich had hidden: numbers win wars. Later historians would write that Germany lost the war the moment it tried to calculate against infinity. For the prisoners, the proof was simpler. The bread on the table, the milk in the glass, the train beyond the fence, all were units of a single equation. America had solved it, and the answer was abundance. By December of 1943, the transformation was complete. What had begun as disbelief had turned into quiet comprehension, and finally, surrender. Not of armies, but of faith. The prisoners no longer argued about tactics or strategy. Their conversations, overheard in the barracks, turned toward meaning. How could a nation built on excess remain so disciplined? How could generosity defeat hunger and comfort conquer fear? The omniscient narrator observes that this was the moment when an invisible front collapsed. The old belief that struggle purified a people, that hardship forged superiority, died quietly in the Texas winter. Every breakfast served beneath electric light was a refutation of that creed. They had been taught that abundance made nations weak. Yet here was a country proving that abundance, when organized, made them unbreakable. Letters intercepted by censors reveal the same dissonance. They live without ration cards, wrote one prisoner to his wife. Children here eat more meat than our officers. Another described farmers discarding food that Europe would have worshipped. They waste because they can afford to, he wrote. We worship what they throw away. The words were never delivered, but they remain preserved in archives, fragments of an ideological collapse. Historians later defined this shift as the moral turning point of captivity. The German ideal of heroic deprivation, that to endure hunger was nobility, shattered before the evidence of American plenty. Strength, they realized, did not arise from suffering. It came from systems, electricity, refrigeration, and the relentless management of prosperity. The omniscient voice lingers on their nightly reflections. Men who had marched under banners of destiny now stared at shelves lined with canned fruit, loaves of bread, coffee tins, and sugar bowls that never emptied. The sound of a refrigerator motor replaced the drumbeat of parades. In that steady hum, they heard the death of illusion. The guards noticed changes too. Discipline improved, fewer arguments, fewer escape attempts. The prisoners no longer saw themselves as the chosen remnants of a superior race. They had become witnesses to a civilization that had conquered want itself. And once a man has seen abundance without cruelty, he cannot return to worship scarcity. By Christmas, the camp held a dinner for both prisoners and staff. Turkeys roasted in rows, pies cooled on tables, coffee boiled in vats. The meal was identical for all. The omniscient chronicler marks that moment as symbolic, the end of hierarchy at the table. No slogans, no speeches, only the quiet realization that equality could be served on a plate. Later historians would write that the true defeat of fascism began not in battle, but in kitchens. The ideology of scarcity, that only struggle gives worth, perished under electric lights and the smell of cinnamon. In its place emerged a new conviction, carried home by those who survived, that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of plenty. By the spring of 1946, the last trains began to roll east again. The men who boarded them were not the same soldiers who had arrived 3 years earlier. Their uniforms were faded, their bodies heavier, their eyes older but calmer. Behind them they left wooden barracks, warehouses filled with empty tins, and fields that had long since returned to harvest. Ahead lay a ruined homeland, a continent still. Rationed by hunger. The omniscient narrator sees them at the moment the wheels turned, carrying home not only memories, but proof. They returned to cities without power, to bread lines, to winter coats made from blankets. Yet inside their minds lived a vision that could not be bombed or censored. A country that had fought a global war without starving, that had built tanks and fed children simultaneously, that had turned food into civilization. The ideology of scarcity had died in America's mess halls, and these men carried its ashes back to Europe. Historians would later trace the origins of the German economic miracle to this invisible cargo, the memory of abundance. Former prisoners became farmers, engineers, administrators. They replicated what they had seen. Mechanized barns, refrigerated storage, mass distribution, efficiency through comfort. They no longer believed that virtue came from deprivation. They had learned that prosperity itself could be moral, that the stability of democracy was built on the full stomach. The omniscient chronicler lingers on their re-entry. In shattered villages, they spoke softly of trucks that never broke down, of milk that never spoiled, of factories that worked through the night without complaint. Families listened in disbelief. It was another world, they said, a land that never went dark. They were right. For the men who had seen America's light, Europe would never be dark again. Documents from post-war ministries confirm their influence. Many of the men who had been prisoners in Texas later led agricultural reforms, industrial modernization, or trade programs funded by the Marshall Plan. They taught that productivity was not exploitation, that abundance was not decadence. They had seen a nation where prosperity served everyone, where democracy was a logistical achievement. By the end of the decade, new silos rose across West Germany. Electric pumps replaced hand wells, and schoolchildren drank milk every morning. The omniscient narrator knows that somewhere in those quiet acts of rebuilding, the echo of Camp Mexia survived. The hum of generators, the smell of bread, the sound of trains. reminders that freedom's greatest symbol was not the flag, but the meal. In later years, when journalists interviewed former prisoners, they all told the same story. They had not been converted by lectures or propaganda, but by experience, by bread that was soft, by milk that was cold, by a nation that wasted nothing and feared nothing. We learned that strength, one wrote, is the ability to share. The omniscient voice closes the record here. The war of scarcity had ended. The age of abundance had begun. The men who once fought for conquest became witnesses for creation. They had seen a civilization